gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Really, while we've got this chance here, we've got this preamble. To any werewolves listening, we're calling you out. Come meet us down by Stoker Lane. We're about to throw down. We're tired of your shit, and this is where we're making a stand. This is where we're Vampire Gang. This post was certified by Vampire Gang, the Vamps. Hello, everyone. We are your ghouly gentlemen. I am a geek for fun.
Hey, what's up? I'm that Matt Kid.
And I'm Steve.
And today, we are talking about a very, very broad topic. Probably one of the most far-reaching and broad we could have possibly picked for like a type of fictional character. And that is the creatures of the night, bloodsuckers, the living undead, princes of darkness, and what have you. Vampires. Something that has dominated literature, most famously after Bram Stoker, but even before that, you've got stuff like Carmilla the Vampire and different traditions and different folklores of draining the blood and the undead that you can track it all down to. And it's something that, just like Dracula himself, you can never really kill. They'll go away for a couple of years, but they'll always rise back with a vengeance, and you'll just have vampire storm every couple of decades or so. Sometimes like 5 years or something, and we'll have another vampire craze. Probably the most famous, prolific, and I guess just varied horror trope. Would you guys say that's fair to say?
They're definitely up there. Before, I mean, vampires. You're absolutely right in that they've captured. And it's not just it's like different takes on vampires have captured the public's imagination at different times. And it's like a lot of different monsters, how they can kind of represent different things and they can kind of be interpreted different ways. And so even though, vampires themselves show up in a lot of fiction, there's usually some kind of different new wrinkle added onto them every time they show up. And it's kept them kind of intriguing and varied because there's so many different ways to approach vampire.
It's also one of those things where, because there are so many versions, you sort of see every version has kind of a chip on its shoulder about the previous version. And it's just kind of amusing to historically track down how those rivalries go. Like famously with Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, Joss Whedon was like, we are not doing kissy vampires like Anne Rice. Even though that's exactly what that show turned into.
And that's one of those things where it gives us a lot of blood to drain from this topic, because there are so many different directions you can go of like the types of vampire. But to start us off, the one that caught my eye the most, mainly because, again, this is probably the one I'm the biggest fan of, and the thing I've had to research a little bit more because of a Geeks for Fun project. And I want to talk about, to start with, the Dracula-esque vampire. Dracula himself, characters in that mold with your most standard traits, which are, interesting enough, aren't necessarily what you'd think, because in the book Dracula like can walk in sunlight and like there's a lot of different stuff with that. But I guess just like the popular culture association of what Dracula is, the most classical stock vampire, as a monster, as a character. What do you guys think? What are your favorite features of fiction with them? Are there any problems with that? And then I think we can move into different directions out of that, of like, because I think every other vampire thing that's been created has normally been in a response to that, either encouraging it, evolving it, or to reject it. So Matt, I guess, classic vampire, what you got?
I really like the film the Batman versus Dracula, and I think that in a lot of ways, no, but seriously, yeah, Dracula is, he is kind of the most archetypal when you think of a classic vampire with the accent, with the cloak, who lives, mysterious and all aloof. I love Dracula. I mean, I love anytime Dracula shows up in something. And I joke about the Batman versus Dracula, but I mean, like, there's a reason that a character introduced in like the late 1800s is fighting Batman. He's this mythic figure who has become not just like another horror monster, but has become this sort of stand-in for just the idea of vampirism. And so Dracula has always been the vampire type. I kind of lean towards the gentleman vampire who's seductive and svelte and can kind of seduce you with his presence and things like that. Because that's the thing that's what I always was drawn to about vampires, as opposed to like werewolves and things like that. Vampires are the monster that hide in plain sight. They're the monster that stalks without you knowing they're there. They're very human in that way, that you wouldn't suspect that there's some sort of evil being underneath this exterior. And so Dracula, at least in the interpretations that I'm familiar with, always kind of leans into that. He's this very suave, sophisticated person. And I think that really gets at the core of what makes vampires terrifying, is that it is that evil hidden underneath the surface, as opposed to something like a giant, Frankenstein's monster type creature. And he's not going to walk into a party, seduce your wife, and then murder them. He's a giant monster. He could. I mean, well, okay, in 2020 he might be able to, TBH. But I mean,
Frankenstein.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I really like that. I mean, I used to, and Dracula's also just become kind of the stand-in for just kind of he is like the poster child of vampires, right? So like, I remember when I was reading X-Men 92 from a while back, the like mid 2000s X-Men 92 run, the X-Men actually have to go deal with Dracula, and there's a council of interdimensional Draculas that have to meet about this like vampire problem. And so like Dracula has just become this like the like I said, like the poster boy for vampires.
He's the Godzilla
in I think a lot of ways.
Like their kaiju.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting to me, because Dracula as a character is so, at least with the modern interpretation of vampires, I guess it's interesting to see how far away they've tried to move from that, because Dracula in his first appearance, and genuinely when he's portrayed, is just pure evil. He is effectively a stand-in for the devil, or like the devil's highest order. Dracula in the book is not meant to be sympathetic or anything. He's just there to kill, which, compared to the other great horror literature that we talk about all the time, Frankenstein, complete opposite. Frankenstein more horrible in appearance and buff, I guess you could say. Like, Frankenstein's not sipping wine, but the creature there, you're supposed to have sympathy for Frankenstein's monster. You're supposed to feel for the creature. With Dracula, you're not supposed to have any sympathy whatsoever. You are just scared for the people, and whenever Dracula goes, only pain, death, and destruction are brought. And this is normally kept, which I think is really interesting, and I think it makes him a great foil, and thankfully he's a great public domain foil, where you can literally have him meet anyone. There's a fantastic Halloween audio drama, which you can get on Big Finish for like £5, so that would be like $8 or something, of Sherlock Holmes versus Dracula. And it's fucking sick. It's Sherlock Holmes solving the mystery of these disappearances, and it all leads to Dracula. And then Holmes, the analytical man, the person who always finds an answer, now has to deal with the ultimate supernatural enemy, the unsolvable problem. Like, stuff like that is really cool. You put that against Batman as well. You put that against Superman. You put that in so many different ways, so many different things. You can throw Dracula in basically any story, in any tone, because he's a very simple to understand character with very clear goals, but also can, at face value, can be mocked very easily, and you can make him like a joke and like not a threat. But also, if you flip it to the other degree, and you see Dracula in another room of vampires, you're probably the most scared of him, because he is, again, like the top dog, the apex. So that's always fascinated me, that the fact that we have that, because you don't have that for zombies, you don't have that for werewolves either. You don't have that central figure like you do with Dracula. That kind of, it's very rare to find vampire fiction that doesn't at least reference him, if not establish that he was a thing at some point. What you got, Steve?
Oh, okay.
No, he was just in a being drained of his blood for a second.
yeah, I just got some guys walked into my room and started talking all really sweet. It was weird. Anyway, Dracula, yeah, I think part of the reason Dracula takes off the way he does and why we need to kind of reference him anytime we talk about vampires is, you're right, there were a lot of other vampire stories and fiction that came out before Dracula, but when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, the thing about that novel was it sort of unified all of the varieties of vampire myths that were there at the time. The ability to turn into bats, the psychic powers, the harem of weird vampire slaves, the sort of eternal love story that Dracula sort of turned into. All of that was in vampire fiction. It was all just separate threads, and it wasn't until Dracula that all of those things kind of came together. By like 19th century standards, Dracula is not like the most groundbreaking book of all time or anything. It's a very sort of competent book for its time. But that's sort of why it works, is that it's a very good archetypical version of that story that unifies everything that we understand about vampires. And so anytime you want to talk about vampire fiction, you can trace the origins of all of it just by reading Dracula. It's just a really good universal myth. And it's really hard to find anything that doesn't, at least on some level, almost like flirt with adapting that original story. And it's hard because there's only so much you can do with the original book version of Dracula, since he's so bound to his context and so bound to the story with Mina and everything. But it's interesting nonetheless, because everyone still always wants to go back to that, and I still feel like we have yet to get a perfect adaptation of that book. Mm-hmm. I like the 90s Bram Stoker Dracula. I think it's a good movie, but I can totally see why most people don't.
You ever seen the BBC?
The thing
not the modern one, but like I think it was the 1970s.
The
BBC.
one directed by Francis Ford Coppola with Gary Oldman as Dracula.
No, all right, then you haven't seen it. But there's one that the BBC did in the 70s, which is probably the most accurate to the book there's ever been, and it's a good one. They even go to the exact locations of the book to film, which gives it a kind of unique sense. Whereas like the Gary Oldman one is definitely entertaining, but like it's nuts.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen that one. I've seen a lot of the Dracula movies, but I haven't seen that one. I saw the BBC one that Stephen Moffat did. No God, was that bad? But that's a whole other conversation for another time. My favorite versions of Dracula tend to be the ones that sort of exaggerate the idea that he's become so popular, and that's what's so interesting about him. So the Batman versus Dracula, like, all jokes aside, that's legitimately a really good movie, and it's a really good version of Dracula.
Oh, I adore it. I'm not kidding. I fucking love that movie.
Yeah, that movie's fantastic. It is so much better than it has any right to be, because it's just it's a movie where Dracula shows up and he realizes his myth and power of fear has been co-opted by Batman, and then Batman kicks his ass in the most dramatic Dracula fashion possible. Like, the ending of that movie, where he turns on the bat signal and then shields him just long enough to put a bat symbol on him before smashing his face. That's the most dramatic Dracula move of all time. I love that movie. I think it's a really, really good movie. And then some of the other stuff where Dracula shows up and sort of plays up that myth that's really fun is that there's the season 5 premiere of Buffy is actually called Buffy versus Dracula. And in the universe of that show, vampires play by very different rules than Dracula. And when Dracula shows up, It turns out that he's a vampire, but he's also been using different kinds of magic through the centuries he's been alive. And so he's more of a threat than other vampires because vampires don't typically mess with that stuff. And so he can turn into a bat, but no one else can. And he's mesmerizing, but no one else is. And other vampires also kind of have like a weird jealousy because Dracula's just like the David Blaine of vampires. And that's just legitimately fun. And he kind of looks like David Blaine. But that's really cool. The trouble, though, you sort of run into is because Dracula is just the embodiment of pure evil, you kind of run into historical gray areas and territories where pure evil has weird definitions that just don't fly anymore. I didn't know this for the longest time. My ex actually brought it up to me a couple years ago when I mentioned the movie. But the problem with Nosferatu, which is a Dracula movie that was before Dracula was in the public domain, so they had to change up all the names, but it is a Dracula movie. But the trouble with Nosferatu is that the way they designed that character is all for the time coded language about Jewish people. Mm-hmm. And so the metaphor of that movie is that Jews are like vampires. And that's just that's a thing that's sort of lost to time, but you do have to sort of wrestle with of when you create those weird pointy-eared vampires with long noses and long fingernails that live in castles and have a lot of old money. You say it all out loud, I'm like, oh, I see where the problem is.
Mm-hmm. And that is probably a good to keep it on the vampires in general thing. I do think that is probably a good thing to talk about because, like most horror, the origins are normally rooted in the fears of the time, as nonsensical or bigoted as they were. And the vampires are very, very big distinction of that. They always kind of reflect the invader archetype. The suave foreigner who's going to steal and seduce and corrupt the purity of your women. There's a reason why virgin blood in vampire fiction is normally always praised as like so sacred. Even when we moved past the immigrant angle and we focused more on just like the sex angle, it was still very much against like Christian values and the sanctity of the home and the family and the wife being the obedient. She's now gone wild and crazy, and now she's the bad girl who needs to be stopped. But it's the innocent girl who's like that shit is rampant. It's in Dracula, but it's rampant throughout just all vampire fiction to some degree or others. Whereas the best vampire fiction normally does take a minute to go out of its way to call that shit out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how early vampire fiction, Dracula and around that time and some of the stuff before it, is representative of a really particular historical period of the sexual repression. And the interesting thing about that historically is it's not even necessarily that culturally people were repressed, it's that people weren't just in public allowed to talk about it. And so sex practices of the 19th century are really complicated and really bizarre. And having no way to talk about it just kind of made it more complicated and more bizarre. And so then Dracula comes out, and you start putting all of that up into the forefront. I mean, it wasn't all Dracula, but like it's part of Dracula's story is that sex angle. And then vampires just become this symbol for sexuality. And I think what's really interesting is when vampires shift in focus from being gothic horror monsters to being things that are predominantly associated with like women's fiction, which is just a weird jump to make given the origin of that stuff, but it also makes a whole lot of sense. Where if you're going to have them be born in a period of time that's widely considered to be very sexually repressed, and then have them be the embodiment of pure unrestrained sexuality, and then have a long history of men who are incapable of talking about sex in a mature way, then naturally the next step is to just turn every vampire story into a romance story. Like Twilight makes complete sense in the history of vampire fiction.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And what I think is interesting about that specifically, and probably what led to it, is throughout their entire history, vampires have really never been masculine. which is really like even Dracula when he had his fucking mustache in the book and he's this old guy, he's still very elegant. He's the one who makes all the dinner. He's the one who prepares it. He has no servants. He's always wearing the finest of clothes. He never really raises his voice. When he drinks blood, it's a very sensual, it's not like a forceful act. He's not ripping people's throats out, which is what we've kind of got to. But even then, when we do modern vampire fiction, we have people rip their throats out. It's not like zombies where that they're literally like biting down and eating people. They'll normally like hold it above their head and like let it drip down on the tongue. Like it's all very like, no one's muscular. No one's posing and flexing. Like everything a vampire does is very balletic, very, very operatic. It has a lot in common with the Phantom of the Opera. In just this kind of grand sweeping emotion. Everything's so heightened. Everyone feels something so intensely is what the vampires do. Is vampires are sensitive ass motherfuckers. So it's always, it's always, I think, led to that appeal. Kind of going from that forbidden fruit to now being a vehicle where many women authors can explore that and what that means, which is what you lead to something that I really like, I guess moving to like our favorite interpretations of like types of vampires. Is like, that's how you get Interview with a Vampire, which is just all about that. It's all about the repression and the emotions and the feelings of these immortal beings. What happens when you bite a child and then they can never grow up as a result, and they have all this power, and they're mentally can change, but physically they're locked in. And that's the same for everyone else. Is no one else can talk to you like that except the worst people, and you have to sustain yourself on this barbaric act. All of that is so interesting to me, and that's why I guess if I had to pick something that appeals to me the most about vampires, it's normally the immortality angle. It's normally the idea of, okay, you become a vampire, probably a very sweet deal compared to most horror movie transformations. Like, you get to keep your looks, stay young forever, you can fly, get crazy ass powers, and all you have to do is drink blood, and it doesn't necessarily have to always be humans even. So it's just like, shit, way better than being a zombie. Like, I'll take it. But at the same time, it's like, okay, what does that look like 500 years down the line? What does that person become? That's fascinating to me. That has always been the most interesting thing of the curse of immortality with vampires. It's not exclusive to them, but I think they found like the trick to it, where kind of like X-Men, where the genius thing about the X-Men is you get to have every single character have a shared origin of just they're mutants. That's all the exposition you need. They're vampires and they've lived so and so years. Immediately clues you in on what that character might be like, or your preconceptions of that character. If you have a room of vampires in a room and you start listing their ages, you can kind of gauge exactly what that room dynamic is. And that's just fascinating to me, that you can do that with these characters.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about favorite interpretations of vampires, I'm going to have to go into it a little bit here. And this, I promise this is not just going to be me fucking selfishly going on a rant about something I really love, even though it is going to be that. Even though it is going to be that, but it's also going to be relevant. One of my favorite things about my favorite interpretation of vampire and vampire mythologies has always been the extremely actually important tabletop role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade, which came out in 1991. And again, like I said, this is not just me talking about a thing I like, because this is actually pretty important to modern vampire popular culture. In Twilight, for example, they posit that vampires and werewolves are natural enemies, that there's a cabal of vampires that control society on some high level from the shadows. That's all Vampire the Masquerade. Vampire the Masquerade arguably created, but definitely popularized the idea that vampires and werewolves are natural enemies, things like that, at least in the modern context. And Vampire the Masquerade's really interesting because it pretty much looks at any type of vampire that could exist and breaks it down. And I'm not going to go jumping into crazy lore here, but it breaks it down into different bloodlines and different clans that all come from this group of progenitors dating all the way back to the first vampire Cain of Cain and Abel fame. And it's really interesting because it takes all these different things about vampires, like immortality, and, you know, kind of dealing with the fact that they live by doing this kind of horrific act, like you said, and it tries to find a way to turn that into a mechanic in a tabletop role-playing game, which is very fun to me. So you have like this humanity system, and if you basically always have this kind of this beast inside of you that is just hungering for blood, and you have to keep that creature in check by, you know, trying to not lose your humanity as you play the game. So they actually take a lot of these ideas that are kind of in the themes of these stories, and they make them more just at the forefront of, like, yes, if you constantly go out and feed on people to the point that they die, and you just attack people in alleyways and feed on them until they are completely drained of blood and then leave their corpses, you are going to start losing touch with your humanity, and you're going to start forgetting what it even is to be human. You're going to start just viewing these beings as lesser than you. And so it's really cool to take those ideas and try to work them into something that that actually functions as like as an interactive piece of fiction. But Vampire the Masquerade is hands down my favorite interpretation of vampire lore, which is kind of cheating because it's a tabletop role-playing game, so it's basically a textbook of lore. So it's like there's just a lot to choose from. It is funny though, because in Vampire the Masquerade, the Camarilla, which is the shadowy group of vampires that enforces the Masquerade, which is just the rules of don't let humans know we're a thing, they hate Dracula because Dracula flagrantly broke the Masquerade in the most huge way possible, which is in the fiction of, and this is kind of kitschy, but it's kind of funny, in the fiction of Vampire the Masquerade, Dracula went to Bram Stoker and made him write a book about his life.
That is such a fucking Dracula move as well.
Yep, he was this in Vampire the Masquerade lore. Dracula's important. He's not like the be all end all, because that's Cain. Like Cain is the be all end all, but Dracula's very important, and he was just this dude who like found out about vampires and kept kidnapping them until he finally got one of them to turn him. Like, he was just like, I want to be a vampire. And they're like, no. And then he finally got someone to turn him into a vampire. And then he just was the most baller vampire ever and made someone write a book about his life. Like, he was just a fucking asshole. Like, it's great. But it's, like I said, you know, it's just it's a lore, and it's a take on the vampire mythology that I really like. And it's very, very important for understanding vampire fiction in the late 90s to early 2000s. Twilight, and especially Underworld, are basically Vampire the Masquerade fan fiction, especially Underworld. Because Vampire the Masquerade takes place in the World of Darkness, along with several other tabletop RPGs, in what they call a goth punk setting. And so they bring together vampires, werewolves, hunters, wraiths, changelings, mummies, all these things existing just in like a modern day setting with this very gothic, this very punk sort of environment. And if you didn't have that tabletop role-playing game released in 91, you wouldn't have had Underworld look the way it was. In fact, the Underworld writers got sued by the people who make the Vampire the Masquerade books, and they had to settle out of court. So I mean, it's this super influential thing that no one talks about. Anyways, I'm done. I love it. Anyways, I can't transition out of this, so someone else can.
If we're going to favorite vampire representations, I mean, I feel like I bring it up in every single video we do, but mine's gonna be the Buffy verse.
What?
Oh no,
Steve!
I didn't see that.
I've never
coming.
heard of this show before. What's the exact premise and episode summaries?
Buffy?
So let me break it down for you episode by episode about both shows. So episode 1, Welcome to the Hellmouth.
Oh my god, he knows the titles of my name. Steve Maxey, the original Buffy stan.
That's weird.
You know, I might as well be at this point. I fucking love Buffy. It's Buffy the Vampire Slayer / Angel and literally Buffy / Angel. And Castlevania. I really like the Castlevania games.
Ooh,
Castlevania is great. But I imagine we'll get to Castlevania as we go through this because the Netflix show is so popular now, and the stuff with Warren Ellis and all of that. But Buffy and Angel are my favorite versions of vampires because it's a very simplistic, kind of powered down version of what we normally get with vampire fiction. Buffy the Vampire Slayer vampires have all of the weaknesses of vampires that they've classically always had, with none of the perks. They're always bottom feeders. They're almost always killed like very quickly after they just rise up out of the grave. It actually takes a couple days after being bitten and drinking blood for you to be able to become a vampire. The sunlight weaknesses are there, the crosses are there, the holy water is there, you need an invitation to enter into someone's house is there. It's all of that stuff. But then because that show has got all this demon mythology, vampires aren't 100% demon. They're humans that have had a demon put inside them. And so by that logic, they're just kind of half-breeds, and so they're a much lower level. They're weaker than basically everything else in the universe of that series. And they have a designated person whose entire job and existence is to do nothing but kill them. So they're not exactly very glorified. What Buffy does that I really like, though, is because vampires have always historically towed this line between what it is to be human and what it is to give into those instincts, is they institute this rule that Joss Whedon was very much against when it first showed up with Angel. Like literally, David Greenwald pitched the premise of what the Angel character was, and Joss Whedon, and he said this multiple times, he said that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And he let it happen, and then we turned it into a TV show, but Joss Whedon was not the showrunner of Angel until like season 4. So, and it's only a 5-season show. So Joss Whedon really does not care for Angel, but it's Angel that's the reason that their vampires are so interesting to begin with. The basic premise of their vampires is when you become a vampire, your soul, which is a tangible material thing, leaves your body. And because you don't have a soul, the demon that's inside you just gets to run rampant and be a killing machine. You can't necessarily hold vampires accountable for their actions because they physically lack a conscience in that universe. Like they can't help it. That's just who they are. So Angel gets turned into a vampire in the 1700s. He kills a woman, and her family curses him with his soul back. And so when he gets his soul back, he remembers everything he did as a vampire and has a human conscience. And he spends 100 years basically trying to atone for the fact that he killed and maimed and raped hundreds and hundreds of people for a century. And the angle of the curse is his soul will only leave him after he experiences a moment of true happiness. But if he experiences a moment of true happiness, then he'll turn back into Angelus, which is his evil vampire self, and kill everyone that made him happy to begin with. And so he can never really be too happy, and it's like the perfect catch-22. But as the shows go on, you start to get like this really complicated breakdown of what it means to be a vampire with a soul. And because Angel's the only one until Spike shows up later, it makes for this like really interesting dynamic where Angel's trying to be a human being, except he's physically not a human being and he's not allowed to engage in any of the things that make human beings important. So we're human because of our relationships. We're human because of our social interactions. We're human because of our love and sex lives. And Angel's a human, except he literally can't do any of those things. And it's just like this really interesting, like, you'd have to like really legitimately hate the person you're giving this role to, because it's just the worst existence. And this David Boreanaz basically plays Angel for 7 seasons of Buffy and 5 seasons of Angel as literally just perpetually depressed because he can't be anything except perpetually depressed, which is probably why I like it so much. I really like
Are you trying to tell us something? Was Death God still your vampire name, and then you got your soul back?
I miss it. It was actually my Bleach name back when I used to read that. But so the thing that happens in season 4 of Buffy is Spike, who's kind of like Angel but British and hilarious and a jackass, and just really really funny all the way through. He gets a chip installed in his head where he can't hurt people, and so it's like a neurological device that basically says anytime you have the intent to harm someone, you're going to get a shock. So it's just like a Pavlov's bell kind of situation, and he has that for like literally 3 years. And then suddenly the chip is out and he gets a soul. And it brings up this really interesting question of, is it the soul that makes these people human? Is it the choices that they're making? Can Spike, who's actually done legitimately good things as a vampire without a soul, does that somehow show that like Angel's kind of being over dramatic about this whole thing? Like it's really interesting that the whole series and both series mess around with this idea that vampires are these horrible killing machines that feed on human life, but they don't have to be. And they kind of make the choice to be like that every single day. And we try not to hold them accountable for their actions because they don't have the consciousness to try and make different choices. But even if they did, they can't be humans either. So they're just kind of perpetually stuck in existential limbo. And I just find that so interesting.
What I find fascinating about that, the fact that it's specifically related to both you and Matt bringing up two, on surface level, very different interpretations. One where the vampire does have their humanity, but it is something they have to constantly fight to keep. It is something that is being clawed away from them, and they have to hold on to it tight. And that is the dilemma. Versus the angel dilemma, where you are given your soul back, but you have to almost push it away to keep it. Like you can't fight with happiness and all the human things to remind yourself of that, because then that's too close and then you'd lose it. It's like that's it's almost like the flip side of the same thing, but they're both dealing with the very fundamental issue of what does it even mean to be human? What does humanity mean? What does a soul even mean? What is the definition of good? What is the definition of evil? Which probably makes sense that it all stems from Dracula, who started out as a very, for that time period, clear distinction of that. As we've progressed and as we've evolved and matured with our fiction, we've started to, okay, what does the good version of that look like? Is there such a thing as pure good, as nebulous form of soul, nebulous concept of humanity? And if there is, then how can people achieve it, and how can people go to it? And then the answer to both of your things, from Nightmare on the Masquerade, or in the case of Spike or Angel, is just like, no one's pure good. Every single part, the metaphor here is just we all have to fight to do that every single day against temptation. Obviously, you two aside, I know I have to deal with the hunger for consuming blooded virgins, but everyone else has to deal with just like general, should I have raised my temper that day, or should I have lied to that person, should I have tried to reach out, or those questions you ask in your head are what basically the best kind of vampire fiction does, right? Is it puts it on the biggest scale possible. It makes our everyday journey to try and be better than we were the day before and try and be good people, it makes that biblical, it makes that mythic, it adds weight, it adds hundreds of years of other people who have tried and failed to do that same thing, and you, the protagonist or the player or your whole friend group or whatever have you, or even in the case of Twilight, of you being brought into that world, and you see people, and you're on the outside and you see people doing that struggle. What does that look like? How large it is, and all of those things. Just so interesting. And it's got real weight to it. It's something where vampire trends do kind of come and go, but the questions at the heart of it, no matter what kind of shape they take, I don't think we're ever going to be rid of them, because we're never going to reach a point where people are content and think they are happy and think they are 100% okay all the time, every day. Every day is a different type of challenge, small or large, and vampires just blow it up, which is why, for one of my favorite interpretations, I really love when it doesn't blow it up. It's just vampires in the most realistic day-to-day situation you could give them, and that is what we do in the Shadows.
I fucking love that movie.
The movie is fantastic, and the recent show, which is 2 seasons now, is just as good. And it basically just strips all of that away. It keeps all the mythology. It keeps people around for hundreds of years, thousands of years. It keeps all the magic. It keeps all the witches. But it's just like, okay, so like, I just have to live in an apartment still. If I'm just a regular vampire, it doesn't help me pay my bills any better. I still have to just kind of exist. And how do I interact with other vampires when they're just regular other people who are really old? They just look young. So we've got all these other things. Like, that to me it's played really well for laughs. But just in general, that's almost just as fascinating to me to imagine, okay, yeah, but what would that actually be like? Just in your day-to-day, if we were vampires, not much would actually change, let's be real. It would just, wow, shit, I don't have to pay for food anymore, but now I have to have like this whole moral fucking dilemma, I guess. More baggage.
Wear dark clothes, don't go out in the sun, avoid holy water, don't walk into a church. So it's basically my life already.
I mean, look, man, you're already almost there. So
yeah. Like, fuck, I don't even keep my blinds open in my apartment. I might as well be a vampire.
You know what my favorite thing about like those cliche vampire tropes? We've reached the point where saying the cliche vampire tropes are cliche and stupid is cliche. Like, how many things open with like, oh yeah, you're a vampire, but like running water doesn't hurt you, and like crosses are stupid and they don't hurt you. Like, we've gotten to the point where all those cliches, so many vampire fictions dismiss them and actually draw attention to dismissing them. And so like vampire mythology is kind of like just going around in circles at this point. It always makes me laugh anytime I see that.
What I fucking hated about BBC's Dracula miniseries, because it does that stupid ass thing of having an author audience insert character that's just asking stupid ass questions about the premise the whole way through. And I hate that
Chris
so
Thorndike.
Much. Huh?
I'm sorry.
oh my god.
I always refer to that character as...
Please, Matt, control yourself. Let's not ruin Steve with our dark knowledge.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Steve. I'm so sorry.
I was just saying, so it's that character who like asks like really ridiculous questions that just make you not enjoy the premise. So like, Dracula can't enter something until he's invited in, and she just like starts babbling about like, what do you feel? Like, is there a barrier going on? Is it in your head? And like, it tries to deconstruct the rules and tries to make it seem like it's funny that it's asking these questions over and over and over again, and it just comes off as obnoxious. Like, look, I bought into the premise that this dude's name is Dracula and he's a vampire. You don't have to make fun of it as you're telling me the story. It's really obnoxious.
See,
Yeah.
I could understand just like on how it's like that, right? Like I'm gonna, because that is what it is, right? It is bringing up the interesting things of the premise of the Dracula mythology, of the vampire mythology, and it's trying to just openly state them in a very blunt, matter-of-fact manner to get across. But I don't necessarily believe that's done out of making fun. I think that's much more akin to, you'll get those like superhero mythology things, or like fact books, or even in sometimes in people's runs, right, where they just go into the deepest detail of like, how would heat vision even work? How would Wolverine's claws work? What is it to have they try and add like that element of pseudoscience, and sometimes it is done to play up the absurdity of it, but sometimes it's just done out of a wanting to really dig under the surface of the thing and try and get it. And why I'm gonna give Moffat the benefit of the doubt and Gatiss, because Gatiss himself did a really, really good Dracula documentary in the lead up to that series being premiered, where he just went throughout the history of every Dracula adaptation. He went to a museum where they had Bram Stoker's fucking scribbled notes for when he was coming up with the names and stuff, and like all these like his random like bursts of ideas he had while he was writing the book, which is fascinating to see. So I think that's mostly done now out of a love for the character. I don't think that was done out of making jest, especially because while that is happening, it is also probably one of the most fucking brutal versions of Dracula. Yeah, he is not meant to be a gag or inefficient in that. He is ripping nuns' heads off. So I can understand it's probably like a tonal thing. But to me, how that came across, and BBC Dracula in general, I think, which is interesting because it's probably the most recent Dracula. Yeah, because like it came out at the start of this year and nothing else has came out after because of the
it was
apocalypse.
this year.
Yeah, so like it is the apocalypse. That's crazy, right? So like that is probably the most recent vampire fiction of in the entire world right now, which is really funny. How that deals with it and how they approach it, I think, is interesting because it kind of asks the usual questions with modern vampire interpretations, like how straight do you want to play it, and it doesn't kind of want to take the Moffat style Doctor Who kind of tongue-in-cheek gag thing as well. But at the same time, I think there are some moments where it really portrays, I guess, the reality of age and what age specifically tends to do to people on an immortal character, which is rare, is where Dracula in most depictions, when he is committing atrocities, it's normally like a sense of like thrill or seriousness, like it just like deadly, like a hunter mode activated. How BBC plays it is very much more akin to a guy who's just really bored of it at this point, and he's trying to find ways to keep himself awake. Which is really like the fact that he's just like, oh yeah, well, I didn't know a baby could turn. Hey, let's just fucking keep this one because I want to see how that turns out. Like stuff like that, I think is really interesting when talking with like the aspect of how a character can change. And like spoilers, I mean, it's been out for it feels like forever now because again, apocalypse. But the aspect of how it ends, where the ending of he's not actually weak to the sun, he's not actually weak to any of these myths. It's just he's been around for so long, and people have said these things about him. He's hard when you're that old. It's very hard to remember, and you're draining people, and you're getting their memories and their personalities through their blood. It's very hard to keep straight what you can actually do or not, which I think is interesting. Like, I'm kind of sure I can't get killed by sunlight, but people keep saying I can, so I don't really want to fucking risk it. like that to me is like, I'd be the same. It's just like, well, if there's a big hoo-ha of people trying to kill me with stakes, I'm definitely not gonna risk that shit. Because what if the off chance that they're right? So like stuff like that I find interesting, but definitely that series is a very mixed bag. There are just elements of it which I think are worth pursuing, and there are some interesting ideas in that one.
I love that. That's actually a flaw you can take in Vampire the Masquerade, is your character can be superstitious.
Yeah.
And be like I know, like because in Vampire the Masquerade, like none of that, the like stake to the heart will paralyze you until the stake is removed, but that's really about it. And sunlight will kill you, but other than that, like running water, crosses, none of that shit does anything. But you can literally, as you're creating your character, some people in the world of darkness just believe that stuff irrationally because they're paranoid and scared. And you can take those flaws to be superstitious and just stand outside of doorways while the rest of your party walks into the house, and it's just like, are you fucking? Why are you standing there?
Look, bro.
So I do love that shit where it's kind of an acknowledgement of those tropes and seemingly fucking random ass selections of which tropes are actually true or not, depending on which vampire fiction you're looking at.
And what I think is interesting about that specifically with vampires and as fiction, as a fictional myth, there are accounts in religions of stuff of like very similar things to vampires, which have led to vampires being, but there is never a singular myth of what vampires are. They're not like Thor or like the Sekhmet or Osiris or any of these other things. That they're not actually, people never actually really believed in what we view as vampires until modern day. So what I find interesting about that is they're very creatures of story. They are creatures of the spoken word. They are creatures of humans telling these stories and us making up the rules as we go along. We get to pick and choose which ones apply and which don't, which is very, as a writer, to me, when you talk about them, you have a character actually acknowledge that. That's just fascinating to me, because then you're really dealing with when a creature is made of just stories and they are a myth that has no religious foundation even then to back it up, and obviously religious stories and what have you, but vampires don't even have that. They are inherently just completely fictional. So if a character becomes aware of that, what does that do to them? What is the, which is kind of like goes back to the Batman versus Dracula, where Dracula has now kind of become meta-contextually aware that when most people see dark cape on a gargoyle in the night, they're most likely going to be thinking of Batman now. Which is like, to Dracula, that is kind of a fucking dig. It's like, hey, hold on a bit. This guy not only plagiarized me, but fucking Zorro's over here waiting for his paycheck. Like, what the hell is this Brozo doing? Like, don't even get me started on the Shadow. Like, that's interesting because you get to talk about the legacy of Dracula, the legacy of vampires. Stuff like Joss Whedon saying, "Oh, that's the most stupid idea I ever had." Just all fucking stupid ideas. It's not real. Like, there's no actual foundation for any of this mythology. We've just, as a culture, there are just kind of sacred tenets we kind of take, where sometimes if you do mess with vampires a little bit too much, people get very reactive. Which I don't even want to say in case of like a Star Wars fan or something, but just when you watch it doesn't necessarily feel right, and I think that's almost like a case by case basis. Like Twilight is probably the biggest example of that, where just seeing a vampire visually depicted in sunlight with the marble skin sparkling, inherently, that's an interesting idea for a character design and a visual, but is it really a vampire? And obviously, it's become so popular and so renowned in the public lexicon, and Robert Pattinson can do whatever the fuck he wants and be gold. So like, I'm not gonna tell him what he can and cannot do. But it's interesting that we have these rules that are completely up to our discretion, yet some of them are a little like closer to our heart than others that we don't want to see go, because they kind of make up the DNA of the thing.
Well, and Twilight's an interesting example because a lot of the backlash of Twilight, like Twilight's not a great series. It's not a particularly well-written book. They're not particularly well-made movies, but they're not like any worse than anything else as far as fiction is concerned. But Twilight gets this kind of uncontrollable backlash because girls really, really liked it growing up. Like, it was really popular with, like, middle school girls. And I remember being in middle school and knowing every single girl in school was reading Twilight. And there is just this history of every kind of accusation we lob at Twilight for being, like, bad or unhealthy or toxic or whatever applies as much, if not way more, to anything else that, like, adolescent boys are going to consume, too. So when we like come up with the question of whether or not Twilight's like the correct form of vampires, or whether or not they're really vampires, it's something that we don't find ourselves asking anytime there's any other diversions of vampire fiction out there. Like, the way Buffy and Angel played up vampires was very different than anything that came before it. No one was asking Joss Whedon, why did you change vampires to be something that aren't even vampires anymore? Anne Rice is similar, where Anne Rice's vampire books are basically like Jane Austen wrote Dracula, you know? Like, it's just a bunch of, like, really aristocratic dudes chilling in rooms and having talks about, like, really deep interpersonal relationships, and no one questioned that. It's just one of those things where I feel like Twilight does a lot of things differently, but it doesn't do them so differently that it's, like, any more special than anything else, you know?
Mm-hmm. It's it's definitely the.
It's not one of those things. It's not even like the first thing to do the lovesick vampires. So, like, for example, there's an episode of Buffy in season 3 called Lover's Walk where Spike comes back and his girlfriend Drusilla's broken up with him, and he's got this really, really good line where he says, "I might be love's bitch, but at least I'm man enough to admit it." Like, Joss Whedon kind of invented the vampires are nothing but fantasy romance boyfriends, and no one's mad at him about that.
I mean, I don't know. What year did Buffy come out? Did Buffy come out before or after Interview? The books.
Buffy's 1997.
Okay. Because I think it's after. Because I definitely.
It's definitely after the books. I just mean in the sense that, like, the vampire logic and stories of Buffy are almost entirely like love triangles and shit. Mm-hmm. Which, as a massive consciousness shift of what vampires were, I think was probably bigger and more aware than Interview with a Vampire was at the time.
Yeah.
Like,
definitely.
Buffy was the Twilight of its day, is what I'm saying. And then when Twilight came out, I feel like we gave Twilight a lot more flack for doing things that Buffy already did, and no one was mad at Buffy for doing them. Which just kind of speaks to the sexism angle of, like, a lot of guys watched Buffy, a lot of girls read Twilight, but both of those things are very similar when you really break it down.
And I also think Twilight specifically got such a vehement response, as it was the first major vampire thing of the internet age. It was the first major vampire thing where memes were a thing, where people would go on message boards or watch YouTube reviewers just scream endlessly about ridiculous shit, and like the idea of like the cinema sins and stuff would just popping up of like, look how fun it is to watch a movie and dissect every single scene to nauseum and pretend that you're doing criticism. Like, that's definitely the thing, is like Twilight was such it came so fast and came so hard at such a moment where it did wonders for its popularity because it was everywhere, but also gained that garnishing of hate because a lot of adolescent boys on the internet wanted something to make fun of and have jokes with themselves and be mean to women about it, and that's still not gone away. They always try and find something to do that with. It's just Twilight was probably one of the biggest and major examples of that, which I guess to kind of segue from that to modern interpretations of vampires, because that's where we've kind of been landing on. Lately, it's a really weird spot to see where we are with vampires. We're not so much doing we're well past Dracula type deals, where even the main Dracula adaptation of 2020 can't even stay in the past. It's just like, it just can't. We're very much not even doing the Twilight underworld thing anymore of like vampires versus werewolves and like secret societies. We're almost very much into what do vampires even mean anymore, in a world where the atrocities that you see on the news are like, what do you do in a society where you're trying to say this is the blood-sucking horrible monster, where there is a fucking children are in camps? Like how does, it's just vampires are small potatoes at this point. Like, where do you can't really play them as villains anymore because we've made them so alluring and so sexual and so sympathetic, where the standard stock vampire as a monster is kind of laughable unless you find like a twist to it. But we can't also continue to portray them as protagonists, because then we're also in an age where you are kind of justifying effectively psychopaths. Which is why like stuff like Buffy had to find like, all right, we're going to focus on the hunters and also have vampires in our crew, but they are inherently meant to be different in some way, shape, or form to justify this. Whereas like the stock vampire has this kind of like almost sociopathic, like no conscience in the broadest sense of the term. So that's why I'm kind of curious: is have you guys seen anything recently, or have any kind of feelings of where we're gonna even go with this? Because the zombie trend came and died very recently. No one talks about zombies anymore. But vampires haven't been getting a lot either. It seems like we might have gone into another lull period.
I mean, and I'm so sorry to turn this back to the one fucking thing I know about. The 5th edition of Vampire the Masquerade did come out in 2018. And Vampire the Masquerade is going through like a renaissance in popularity right now. The 5th ed core rulebook came out and was like a huge fucking deal in the tabletop community. Like everyone lost their shit when it came out. And they handle that really interestingly because in that world, they take those messy political conflicts and they make that part of the larger conflict in a sense. Because you have the Camarilla, who's your stuffy old vampires. And then you have the Anarchs, who are basically vampires who just fucking hate the hierarchy. They hate the way that all this works. Anarchs are always consensualist, meaning they only drink blood of people who they've told they're vampires and they're okay with it. Or they're vegans, meaning they only drink the blood of animals. And they want to dismantle these capitalist government systems that the core rulebook of the 5th ed goes out of its way to establish are mostly influenced by these sort of old guard of vampires. And so they tackle a lot of that stuff head on. There's like, for example, one of my favorite bits of lore is that there's a company called Pentex that's like a major like supercorp that owns like a bunch of different companies. And Pentex is most of the board of directors of Pentex are Camarilla vampires. And, you know, they own oil refineries. They own a video game company that does really shitty things. And so, like, they just try to take all the horrible things that are in the world and they just try to incorporate it into the fiction. And they even do, in the most recent edition, they introduced things that are called Thin Bloods. Well, actually, Thin Bloods have been a thing for a while. But Thin Bloods are vampires who are, like, not fully vampire because the vampire bloodline all the way from Cain to today has been diluted so much that now you're getting these thin blood vampires who don't show particular particular talents or particular strong inclinations towards any of the established vampire clans. And so these new younger vampires who are in theory on paper weaker, but because they don't have that inbuilt clan loyalty or that inbuilt clan affinity, the ruling class of vampire is fucking terrified of them, and in fact sees them as a warning sign of Gehenna, the end of the world. So I really like the way Vampire the Masquerade does it, because they just are just like, yeah, the horrible things happen in the world, and vampires would be a part of those horrible things happening in the world. It doesn't blame it entirely on vampires are the villains of the story. They say there are going to be vampires out there who see all this going on and they take advantage of it. They use it to gain political power. And then at the same time, there are vampires who would be the types of people who are out protesting, who are out doing this, that, and the other thing. So I always like that because it just doesn't shy away from it. It just leans into it. And that's always what Vampire the Masquerade has done. But I mean, of course, we've also had things like, the Castlevania anime and things like that they've kind of avoided that because they're just set in a fantasy world that isn't really touching any of that kind of material.
Mm-hmm. And I guess because we mentioned it, I want to get into Castlevania while we've got some time. First of all, though, Warren Ellis shitbag. Now I can,
has to be said.
Now I can just speak freely. What is interesting about Castlevania is it's not the first time this has been done, but it's probably the most clear and central to the story, I guess, because Coppola made Dracula sympathetic, but it was in a much more nebulous kind of I have waded through oceans of time to meet you kind of sense, right? It's not in the moment. He doesn't know these people. We don't really get to spend time with him outside of him being crazy. Castlevania, the Netflix series at least, opens up with Dracula having a charming back and forth with this woman who won't take no shit from him, and from that interaction alone, and then you can see multiple instances when we get to see flashbacks and just how he talks about her, we get to build, oh, okay, so Dracula's kind of chill. Like he's not actively doing shit. He's just kind of chilling in his castle, and then like he's decided to try and change and try and be better. Okay, I'm here. Oh no. And then he wages war to wipe all of humanity out, but not in how the games handle it. It is a wiping all of humanity out as a affront to God, as a these you are God's creations. Well, now you no longer exist. I am the new God. Basically, I am doing this to basically give a middle finger to God. Is Dracula's whole, in the video game lore at least, is his whole deal is he despises everything to do with God, and he rejected God and all of that. In the series, it's much more, oh, he's just doing this so he can kill himself. He's literally just taking out every single human so he has an excuse to starve to death. Which is so fucked up. But it's also played to the extent where you see other vampires actively be like generally worse shitbags than him, like much more bestial, much more animal. And when you see Dracula, he's very calm and very centered, and he never raises his voice, and he's got this very calm and centered voice, like it's very chill. But when he gets up in your face and he's like 8 feet tall, he can just be as terrifying as he is before. But how that ends, and the first season of Castlevania has been out for a while now, how it ends is, again, he kind of sees, oh shit, I'm beating to death my baby boy, my child. What am I doing? What have I done? Just fucking end it. Put me out of my misery. I'm just hate at this point. I'm a thing. And to be self-aware of that and to have that consciousness is fascinating. To do that with Dracula, to play him in such a sympathetic light, where he out of everyone, like we had the thing right of like, oh, getting someone to write a book about him is such a Dracula move. Batman beats Dracula in the most Dracula fucking way. This Dracula's like just sad. He has no time for theatrical or flair. He's just fucking broken. It's very rare to see a Dracula in that capacity.
I love him so much. He's
great. That moment is like, because when I started watching that show, like I was not like immediately in love with it. I was like, yeah, I mean, this is okay, because I don't have a big attachment to Castlevania. But that moment was when I was just like, oh, this has captured my attention, and I've like fucking adored that show ever since. Umir Dracula is phenomenal, and now I'm just thinking about the ending of season 3, and I'm sad. Fucking Alucard, yeah. God damn it!
It ruins in the family.
The games are interesting. The first 2 seasons of the show are based on Curse of Dracula, or Dracula's Curse, whatever it's called, where it is more about Dracula and Trevor. But a majority of the games are about his kid, Alucard, and Alucard in the games is way different than he is in the show. But what I like about the version that we have on the anime is there is this relationship between Alucard and Dracula that's way more complicated than just Dracula evil, Alucard ambiguous, you know? Like, he's actually got more of a personality, and he's putting on airs in a way at the start of the first season that he doesn't have, like, halfway through the second season. Alucard is kind of just pathetic and sad, and so is Dracula, and Dracula just does a better show of it than Alucard does. I will say, though, the one thing about Dracula in the anime that I don't love, and this is a thing from the games, this is a thing just in all fantasy fiction that I'm noticing, is Dracula at the start of it, when Lisa shows up and she starts learning medicine and science and shit from Dracula, Dracula's like, if everyone wasn't so religious, we'd have so many more advancements in science, and you wouldn't think everything is just weird and superstitious. And on one level, you know, you're like, yeah, you're right, kind of if the church hadn't taken over and maybe they would have learned from Dracula how to make a flying machine. But also that's really oversimplistic and kind of bullshit logic, especially when Dracula is the essence of evil. Why would you trust him with technology at all? Like, it's just a fantasy trope whenever we want to do magic versus science, where we say it's because of religion that we are not more scientifically advanced, and that's just wrong, and it's feeding an entire generation of people the wrong information.
And that's always something which I guess as we progress, I'm kind of curious to see where that's gonna go, because we do deal. Religion is a thing in Castlevania. We see hell, we see heaven, so it's not like Dracula saying, "Oh, that's all bullshit, that's all lies." He just hates it. But there is a god, there is a Judeo-Christian, or in some form, that's all meant to have happened. It's just how the church is spinning it is what's bullshit. It's not portrayed that subtly, which I think is definitely and again, just in fantasy media in general, it's normally just a sweep all thing, which is why I do agree with Steve. But I think the idea there is interesting, of not necessarily critiquing the faith, but what people do with that faith, and how people take advantage of it and use it to their own gains to quell the masses, and as what has happened historically.
Yeah, and the games do kind of go into this a little bit more than the show does. You're right, it's almost too subtle in the show, but it is more in the games of like the vampires, and a majority of the characters in the series are always kind of on the outs with the rest of society. And they sort of reveal the weird hypocrisies and stuff within the church, who doesn't really have an understanding of what heaven and hell is like, which I do like and I think is interesting. I always love when vampires like have more intricate and interesting knowledge about God and the Bible than the people with the crosses. So like it's a famous vampire trope now. But it used to be an inversion, and Stephen King does it in Salem's Lot, where if you hold a cross up to a vampire, it only works if you believe in it, which is really interesting. There's an episode of Angel in season 1 called I've Got You Under My Skin, where there's a demon possessing a kid, and it's legitimately got one of the coolest things I've ever seen, because I don't think anything's ever done this. It's an exorcism where Angel's holding the cross, and it's a vampire exorcising a demon with Latin biblical phrases. It's just really fucking cool. I like that mixture a lot. I like that, like, I like when we get stuff like with Dracula has like a very complex understanding of what hell is like and what heaven is and all of that stuff. It can get undermined though sometimes when we do sort of just do the simplistic take of Dracula is actually shunned because not only is he a monster, but he believes in science, which is one of the ways they try to add sympathy to Dracula early on in the Netflix show, where it's like, no, he's not just a monster. He's actually a very worldly, smart, well-read guy, which is true, but you kind of handled that a little better.
Yeah, I think I'm glad that we found a way to start this with Dracula and then end this with Dracula while having a lot of vampire stuff in the middle. Like, if we were doing this as a structural novel, we have done the Chekhov's gun. we have paid off that setup with that premise. This was a fun one, guys. I really enjoyed talking about this. Again, we could just keep going for hours and hours with the minutiae of the whole thing, but I think we covered a good degree of basis of those darn fiends trying to take us all away into their shadowy cape-filled arms. So I'm gonna go jack off with that image just in a little bit, but I guess we'll do recommendations just because it's fun, because we can't really do ratings. What do people recommend if they want to get into vampires? Let's go with Matt first.
What do you think I'm going to recommend? I would recommend
Buffy.
No, yes, Buffy. In all seriousness, no. Obviously, recommending a tabletop role-playing game is kind of hard. So if anything I have said interested you, or if you vaguely like things like Underworld or some of the ideas in Twilight, I strongly recommend to get on Steam and play Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. It is a cult classic RPG from 2004. It's fucking incredible, and it is a great starting point if you're interested in kind of the world of darkness, and if you're interested in any of that type of lore. Strongly recommend it. It's one of the best it's honestly like one of the best RPGs, like one of the best Western RPGs ever made. Very good. I would recommend it strongly.
Buffy, obviously. Buffy and Angel, 2 favorite vampire things of all time. But something different that's also worth taking a look at. I mean, obviously, original Dracula, obviously Castlevania, all the stuff we talk about. But we don't talk about these nearly as much as I feel like we should, because they're really underrated in the grand scheme of all the movies we have now. But the first 2 Blade movies are legitimately really good, fun-ass movies with really cool vampires. And they kind of take a little bit of everything that we've talked about with like the intricate politics and sort of the mythology building of different species having wars against each other. It's got like some of the romance elements to it. It's just got really good kick-ass fight scenes. And superhero movies do not have good fight scenes. I'm sorry, but in the history of superhero movies with fight scenes, 99% of them are kind of trash. Mm-hmm. Blade's got really good fight scenes, and Blade's a hugely underrated badass vampire.
Yeah, all of that, I'll say. In terms of reading, I can't remember the name of it, but Scott Snyder did an original vampire story.
Oh, American Vampire!
American Vampire!
Yes! Fucking yes, with Raphael Albuquerque. I wish I had talked about that, but I haven't kept up with it in a couple of years.
I read the first 2 volumes of it. It's so fucking good.
It's so good! It's really good. So that's one. Al Ewing did Tomb of Dracula at Marvel for a little bit, and that was really good. And outside of the comic sphere, other game stuff with Dracula outside of the Castlevania series, there is one on the fucking tip of my tongue that I can't remember it, but normally when Dracula shows up in games, it's fun. Even if it's bad, it's fun. It's Dracula, come on. But yeah, I was going to stick to the 2 comic recommendations, just to have a different medium for people who want to talk about comics on this one. So those would be this episode of Ghouly Gentlemen. I believe now it's Matt's turn for a review topic.
Oh, shoot. Yeah, it is. Well, it is. We are still kind of in spoopy month. I don't really want to do another horror movie, like a slasher film. But there has been a movie that's been on my mind that is horror themed that I kind of wanted to talk about. Not because I have a lot to say about it, but because I actively don't know that I have a lot to say about it, because I've only seen it once and I kind of want to figure out how I feel about it. But I thought we could do Corpse Bride.
Oh yeah, I forgot that movie existed.
Exactly! That's exactly my point. It's because I was listening to Nightmare Revisited. And then I was like, oh yeah, Corpse Bride is a thing. So there you go, Corpse Bride. It is a thing, and we're gonna review it.
You can catch us then. Until then, I am the Count of the Oppressed.
I am the horror erotica lover.
And I'm just kind of boring because I can't think of a name.
The biggest horror of all! And we will be killing things.